Here's an old brochure from the boatworks, and it's, as it says, the boatworks was started in 1896. Now, my grandfather was born in Oslo, Norway, and when he was age 7, his mother died, and his father didn't know what to do with the 3 children. So the 3-year-old daughter went to an orphanage. John, being 7, went to live on various people's farms, and I think his other sister was about 11. She was farmed out to people to work in a household to do cleaning and sewing and that sort of thing. So John was at a farm sort of like this in Norway, and one of his jobs was to fetch water from a stream. They didn't have water piped into the house. And in the wintertime, the stream froze over, and he had to chop a hole in the ice on the stream. And one day he was out on the ice and he broke through, and he fell under the ice, and the current dragged him underneath the ice for a ways. And he managed to clamber back out and ran back up to the house. And his name in Norway, by the way, was Johan Johansson. And the farm wife said, "Johan, what's happened to you? Come by the fire and get warmed." Well, later the farmer came in and said, "Where's the bucket?" And Johan says, "Well, I guess it's under the ice." The farmer said, "Well, you'll have to be punished for losing the bucket." So here he is at age 15. He got a job working on a coastal steamer. The coastal steamer would be delivering packages to these towns that were situated on the fjords. So here's a typical town on one of the fjords in Norway. Now, one of the main characters in this story is Gus Amundsen, who was born in 1860 in Oslo. And he got married in Horten, Norway. And that happened to be where my grandfather, John Johnson, was living with his father. And when Gus came over to America with his family and eventually started his boat works in White Bear Lake in 1887. Well, earlier that year, Gus was in Horten and he married his wife. And then he came back with his wife to Horten several times. And I think in 1889 he met my grandfather, who was only 14 years old at that time, and said to him, "Well, young man, if you ever come to America, you can come to White Bear Lake and work for me in my boat works." So John remembered that. Here's just happens to be a clipper ship, modern day. This was the one that was used in the movie Windjammer. Some of you might have seen that. But it was docked at Horten, Norway, when my wife and I were visiting there. John, my grandfather, always wished that he could sail in a clipper ship, but he never had the opportunity. So in 1893, he decided to come over to America. And this is a picture of a steamship, the Thingvalla, a Danish line. And it's, I believe, 300 feet long, and it had about 30 first-class passengers up above, and then the rest, the 300 third class, were below deck. And it wasn't very grand. The ventilation was poor. They had kerosene lamps that they would turn off at 10 o'clock at night. Here's another picture of the same ship. Now, this ship could go 10 miles an hour, and there were still some clipper ships at that time in 1893, and with a good breeze, they could go 17 miles an hour. So in the middle of their voyage, the passengers are all up on deck, and they saw this beautiful white sail coming from the horizon, and it got bigger, and it was a clipper ship. And it went right by them, and it was so beautiful that all the passengers started to cheer and clap because they thought it was wonderful. So the trains came to White Bear in 1868, Now, my grandfather, on his voyage in 1893, his ticket gave him also a railroad ticket to as far as Chicago. So when he got to Chicago, he said he was wondering, how am I going to get to St. Paul? Well, he didn't know very many words in English, but somebody told him, when you get to America and you want to find out something, just stand on the platform and holler something in Norwegian. And if somebody answers, then you can get help. So he's in Chicago and he's wandering around, and lo and behold, he met a guy working on the train who was originally from Norway. The trainman was riding in the caboose, and he told John, hey, you can ride in the caboose with me to St. Paul. So he got a ride there, and when he got to St. Paul, he got a hitch on some farmer's wagon coming out to White Bear. So here's what the west end of the lake looked like, and they called it Lake Shore. And the, let's see if my pointer is working here. That Life's Hotel and Resort was about the greatest resort in the St. Paul area in 1880. And then in 1890, Ramaley built this wonderful pavilion. Life's was located where Kowalski's grocery store is now, next to Goose Lake. And Ramaley's pavilion, you know where the VFW club is, and there's a big concrete pier there, fishing pier. That's where the Ramaley's pavilion was. And there was this saloon. It's actually a hotel right there, and that's where the future Johnson Boatworks was going to be. At this time, in 1893, when my grandfather came, Gus Amundsen was living across the tracks on Lincoln Avenue or Railroad Avenue, and later on, my grandfather would be living right across Hinckley from him. So here we have Life's Cottage Park Resort, a wonderful place with excellent boat rental, billiard tables, a sample room, which is another word for a saloon, athletic fields for various sports. And here we have Ramaley's Pavilion, built in 1890, and the main railroad tracks coming into White Bear. Before you got uptown, you got to Lakeshore here, and this is a Lakeshore depot right across the street from the pavilion. And I think there were, 25 trains a day or something like that came out through here. Train travel was the big way to get back and forth. So inside, they had this big auditorium on the main floor. I don't know if you call it the second floor, but anyway, they could hold 2,000 people. And they had plays, they had dances, they had all kinds of programs here. Here's what it looks like from the lakeside. And actually in 1897 and 1898, this was the temporary headquarters for the White Bear Yacht Club. As in 1898 was the first inland, I don't know how many of you know what the Inland Lake Yachting Association is, but that's all the Midwest lakes who race the sailboats. The first inland was at White Bear Lake in 1898. So this is called the birthplace of the ILYA. I'd always thought it'd be great to go to the Ramaley's Pavilion, so with the help of time travel, my wife and I are standing where Nicholas Peterson had his boat rental, right adjacent to the Ramaley's Pavilion. This was 1900. My grandfather would have been 25, but I couldn't find him. So in 1896, my grandfather married Mary Peterson. She was the daughter of Nicholas Peterson. Nicholas and Ingeborg Peterson had a boat rental and later on a lunchroom right on Lakeshore. So from 1880 maybe even a little earlier, White Bear had steamboats. And I imagine they continued on until after 1910. But anyway, I was looking at all this talk about the lake level. And in 1880, best as I can figure, the lake was probably 3 feet higher than it is now. But then in 1890, it dropped 4 feet to 920 feet, which is a foot lower than it is right now. And the people were very concerned. The steamboats like to go up Lake Avenue and stop at Clark Street, and then for people who were at the town of White Bear, and proceed along Lake Avenue up to the Williams House, the resort up by, what's the name of that street? Stewart, yeah. But anyway, for this shallow water, they were concerned about rocks and sandbars. So in the 1890s, they had a steam dredge that actually dug a channel parallel to Lake Avenue from about where Peranto's house is up to Stewart. And even today, that channel is still there. You go out a ways and it drops off. So anyway, the Wildwood, my grandfather's first wife, Mary Peterson, her younger brother, Tom Peterson, was the captain of the Wildwood. Unfortunately, in 1809, there was an explosion, and he was severely injured, and a few months later, he died. And here we have another steamboat that operated out of Rameli's Pavilion. These steamboats would come down, they would be at Lipes or Rameli's Pavilion, go along the lakeshore to Clark Street, pick up passengers there from the town of White Bear, proceed on to the Williams House a little further along, and then go around the island. Maybe they'd stop at the east side of the island there at the Island Clubhouse. Maybe go to Delwood, and then around to Bonamedi, and finally end up at the Wildwood Resort. So here's at the Wildwood Park. The price, I think it says there, 25 cents round trip, 15 cents one way. One of the attractions at the Wildwood Park was this water slide. And they had a board with wheels on it. And you'd come down that slide and zoom across the water. Lots of fun. The management has a sign there that said, it's free, but we take no responsibility for your safety. So here's the Yacht Club dock in 1900. I believe the Yacht Club was started in 1889. But you can see some of the sailboats there. In this little white boat on the right, lower right, is a naphtha steamer. And it uses naphtha for a fuel, and I believe actually naphtha was a working fluid in the pistons. Instead of steam, they had naphtha as a fuel and naphtha as the steam. So here's the Yacht Club in 1912. Notice the sailboat in the foreground. That's a spar that comes off at an angle from the mast is called a gaff rig. And gaff rigs were the early sailboats. And around 1925, they disappeared. And by 1930, almost all of the sailboats you see have a straight mast, and except for a few antiques that might be around. Anyway, the Yacht Club was a beautiful building that time, I think, right on the water's edge. And in 1914, F. Scott Fitzgerald came and performed a play there. And then in I think I'm saying 1900s on all of these, 1922, Scott Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda lived there that summer. They're kind of a rowdy couple with a lot of wild parties. So the Yacht Club members asked them to leave. This is a famous picture of sailing in White Bear Lake. The people are kind of dressed up with full dresses and an umbrella and so forth. And when you're sailing, you have to be careful about gusts of winds because And wonderful picture. The umbrella is still sticking up on the right. There's somebody's hand is coming up here. But the one lady managed to stay dry. She's up on the side of the boat. So here's my grandfather in the year 1900, 25 years of age. And in 1900, the boat builders in White Bear were competing to see which yacht would be chosen to race against the Canadians in a big race up in Canada. They had John O. Johnson was going to build a boat, and Gus Amundsen was going to build a boat he's going to name the Minnesota, and another boat builder, Gene Romele, was going to build another boat called the St. Paul. Well, John didn't have a good place to build a boat, so he went to talk to his mother-in-law, and his mother-in-law had this lunchroom that was empty in the winter because the tourists were only there in the summer. And he said, I want to take out all the tables and chairs and build my sailboat here. And according to the family legend, that's what he did. So here's the 38-foot Minnezitka built for Milton Griggs, which we like to call it the first real A-boat ever built. It's flat bottom and with rounded edges so that when it tips up, it's just that round edge that's in the water and not much resistance, and it glides through the water very nicely. Or when it's flat, it just rides over the top of the waves. So it's a very fast kind of a sailboat. In 1900, they had a lot of races with these three boats. And the Minnezitka that my grandfather built won almost all of the heavy wind races. And the other two boats would win the light wind races. So they had a committee, and they chose the Minnesota built by Gus Amundsen to go to Canada, which White Bear did not win up there. But meanwhile, for the entire season on White Bear, the Minnezitka was the lake champion. And this boat established my grandfather's reputation as a boat builder, and he became known as a preeminent boat builder. In 1904, my grandfather's first wife died, and a year later he married Anna Dorr, who is my grandmother. From his first wife, Grandpa had one son, Milton, born in 1897. And then when he married Anna Dorr, my grandmother, she had two sons, Ivor, born in 1907, I think, and my dad, born in 1910. So here's, I think this is 1902, my grandfather on the left and Gus Amundsen on the right, with a champion of a regatta. I think it's in Green Lake, Wisconsin. The sailor there with the trophy is named Walter Dupay. And my grandfather, according to my dad's name was Walter D. Johnson. And my grandfather named him after this Walter Dupay. And my dad did not like the middle name, so he just used the letter D. So here in 1910, John had been reading all about all of these Wright brothers and other early aviators. So he decides to build an airplane for himself. And this is just an artist view. It did have just two long wings and no tail to speak of. It had a 20 horsepower engine. And in January 1910, he put it out on the ice of White Bear Lake and was able to take off from the ice and get about 20 feet up in the air, and he went about 200 feet before the engine conked out. And so it sort of floated down with help of the wings. It didn't have a real fast descent, but it did break the bottom of it and broke the propeller, and it was damaged beyond repair. But this was the first Minnesota aviator to take off under his own power in the state of Minnesota. So about a year later, he decides to build another airplane. This one is smaller. And he was, at that time, living across the tracks on Lincoln Avenue, and in his backyard, he put together this airplane. And he wanted to get an engine for it, but he couldn't afford it. He couldn't find one that was lightweight and powerful enough. And so he decided to try, I'm going to use it as a glider, and he built a ramp on the back of a big motorboat, put the thing on the ramp, tied a rope to it, and the motorboat went real fast, and it lifted off like a kite. So it was being towed like a glider, and he got up in the air, and then the rope broke, and he was free, and he was gliding around the lake, having a wonderful time, and pretty soon it sank into the water. And people had lined the shore to watch this event. And my grandmother was holding my dad, who was 1 year old, in her arms. And the man standing next to her said, "Well, that's the end of another damn fool." But it wasn't. He was just sitting there in the water thinking about what a wonderful flight he had. So finally he swam out. Well, the story is the people in the motorboat had been watching this flight, and they weren't paying any attention to where they were going and ran ashore. So in 1924, here's a busy road coming out to White Bear. And in the winter time, the snowplows in Ramsey County could not handle the deep snow. Their trucks weren't powerful enough, so if you got a deep snow, you put the car up on blocks and waited for the winter to be over. And in fact, the mail in 1922 was delivered by horse and sleigh. Well, my grandfather didn't like the idea that he couldn't use his car, so he decided to invent a snowplow. And so he's got this rotary snowplow that throws snow out to both sides. It has big fans on the plow that just throw the snow to the side. And he got it patented in 1922. Now, when he built this thing, he thought, well, I better get a patent. And there was a sailor that lived in Mahtomedi, H.S. Johnson, no relation, who was a lawyer, and he said he would patent it if my grandfather would build him a big ice boat. So he did that and got a patent in 22 and a follow-up patent in 1925. So here's a picture in Snoqualmie Pass in the state of Washington. First time the pass was kept open during the winter. At first, John was building his own snowplows, but you can see this one was built elsewhere. There was a company in Minneapolis, a businessman said, I'll build these, and if you'll give me the permission to do that, and I'll pay you a royalty for every snowplow we build. So John thought that was a good idea. In fact, he was getting a nice royalty, and the businessman came to see him after a couple of years and said, you know, you're making more money than we are. I want to buy the patent. So John sold the patent to them. And from that money, he was able to modernize his boat works. And so that gave him a big advantage over his other competitors because all that money that came in from the snowplow. So here's Amundsen Boat Works. You remember that both John O. Johnson and Amundsen were living on the other side of the tracks on Lincoln Avenue, and they were building boats in a shed in their backyard. So Amundsen moved his operation to the lake in 1912. The bottom picture shows a big drive shaft at the top by the ceiling, and leather belts that would come down, and those leather belts would turn to operate the saws and other equipment. The whole thing was powered by a big gasoline engine on the outside of the building. So this is the area about where the boatworks was located. You can't see the boatworks, it's just to the left. Note that at that time, a streetcar came along the bank there, right along the lake shore. In fact, in the early days, the main road from St. Paul came White Bear Avenue, past Cottage Park, and past between the boatworks and the lake, right here. So they had the streetcar and the main highway going by there. There's my dad's brother, Ivor. He decided to build a model of the Constitution. So here's a painting of the boatworks. Edna M., a local painter and friend of my parents, did this painting. And the boatworks operation was on the first floor, and up above, on the left, were the apartments for my grandparents. And on the right, the apartment there was my grandfather's oldest son, Milton, and his family. Here's some of the workers in 1940. In the first row, there's Willie Carpenter, Ed Carpenter, Joe Peterson, Art LaChapelle, and Del Bellinger. And the tall person in the back, who you can't really see, is Milton. And next to him is Ivor. And my dad is back there somewhere. Oh, they had, I might as well mention this, in like around the 1960s, they had 12 to 14 workers, and they could build like 100 boats a year. These are making wooden boats. So they did their own blueprints. My dad here is doing drafting work, and they had a machine shop where they did their own fine machining of pulleys and so forth. And so they did all the work of the boatworks here. So in 1930-31, my Uncle Ivor was racing an A-boat on the lake. He's in the back holding onto the tiller. And I think, if I remember right, my dad's standing up waving. But they were the champion on White Bear Lake in 1931. So here's the crew, my Uncle Ivor with his arms crossed, and my dad on the far right. And here's just a picture of an A-boat. We're going to talk more about the various types of boats. So the A-boat was 38 feet long. So around this time period, they had a Class B, 32 feet. A little bit shorter than an A-boat, but it was still kind of big. So its popularity kind of died out. Racing around here probably not until about 1919, but the Canadians were racing this boat into up to 1927. And then the sea boat, they had an early version in 1905, but I think the official size of this boat was established in 1911. And then a D boat, the same size as a C. In fact, it's exactly the same hull, but it has two sails, and it came about in 1945. Then in 1925, they established the E-boat. At 28 feet, it gave you the feel of a big boat, you know, the mainsail and jib and spinnakers and everything. And was a lot easier to deal with than the great big 38-foot A-boats. So this is very popular for a long time. And then in 1934, they decided they should have a boat for youngsters, especially for children under the age of 16. And so this has been a very popular boat. I forget if this was around 1980 or something. The MCs came along, which was a miniature sea boat. There's one sail, is 16 feet long, and that happens to be John and my wife Carolyn. So ice boats. The boatworks is building ice boats for a long time, but this one happened to be 1933. And ice boats can go really fast. Back in as early as 1908, they were clocking these ice boats over 100 miles an hour. And at that time, airplanes were just in their infancy. They didn't go very fast. Trains didn't go 100 miles an hour. Nothing went 100 miles an hour except an ice boat. My dad liked to outboard motorboats. So my dad's nickname was Buster. His brother Ivor's name was Bud. And his older brother Milton's name was Pete. So they all had nicknames. And so my dad, being a good Norwegian guy, named his boat Jumpen Oli. And he was racing, 1927 to 1933 or so. He was winning races in Minnesota, and he went to a national championship in 33 and managed to finish third. So just another picture of him racing. So here's a view of that end of the lake. The boatworks is on the far right there in the middle, and Amundsen Boatworks would be up near the top. So here's a picture of Pete on the left, Ivor and my dad and my grandfather. So in the boatworks, here's a picture of some decking for an X-boat. And in the back there, my uncle Pete, or Milton, is kneeling down, looking down. They're gluing together two big pieces of spruce lumber to make a wooden mast. And here's one of the workers doing the wooden railing and so forth on a Y boat. Back in the early days, like the 1940s, the deck, or rather the hull of a sailboat, was just a single layer of wood, 3/8 or maybe as a half an inch thick cedar going lengthwise across the ribs. And with the planking that way, they were concerned that the cracks between the planks would have a tendency to leak water, so they would force cotton into the seams before they get that cotton all the way in, and then they would varnish the boat. So here's the framework where they're going to build a boat, and in the back wall there is a box, a long box that extends into the next room with a steam, live hot steam, and they put oak ribs being about, I think they're about 3/4 of an inch by an inch. And they'd get them really hot in that steam box, and then they could bend them over the mold here very easily, and then nail them at a stringer on the sides. In the late 1970s, they stopped building wooden boats, so they took some pictures here. We'll show you how the boats are built. And in the middle there is the mold that has all the oak ribs bent in place. And then the boats are now double planked, so they have a 1/8 inch cedar planks diagonally across those oak ribs. And then over that, they would put 3/8 inch thick white cedar lengthwise. Here they've lifted the hull off of the mold and turned it right side up. And now we're putting beams across where the deck is going to be to support the deck. And this is white cedar that they're using. The ribs were oak, and but a lot of the rest of the boat was white cedar. So there's my dad in the back and my Uncle Ivor putting some decking on the boat. And then in the background there, over the decking, they're putting a canvas layer. And what they did, they painted the wood surface with a thick layer of oil-based paint, and then they would stretch the canvas over that. And while the paint was drying, it would ooze up through the canvas, leaving kind of a nubbly surface. And so your surface at the end is going to be kind of skid resistant, so you're less likely to slip when you're walking on it. And here's the boat getting the various hardware on the deck. A lot of these boats had wooden railings on the side. And we talked about machine shop, the metal parts like pulleys. So here we are back again, E-boat regatta in White Bear. and my dad, Buster, is on W3 in the center there. He's got the pole, he's about to put up a spinnaker. Not very much wind that day. So here's my grandfather sitting on the deck of an old A-boat. And about my grandfather, he had some things he liked to do. One thing when he was younger, he decided he liked dandelion wine. And so he made up a batch of this dandelion wine. And his neighbor was a judge, a local judge named Niles. And he invited Judge Niles over for ice cream with dandelion wine on top. And John was all excited and he said, well, how do you like it? And Niles said, well, John, it tastes like hell. And my grandfather got angry and he said, that damn fool doesn't know what he's talking about. Another thing, prohibition, 1920 to 1933. You could get a doctor to write a prescription for whiskey. And my grandfather got a prescription, 3 shots a day. And you could get the whiskey at the local drugstore uptown. Oh, another thing about prohibition, remember I was showing you these Class B boats. They were racing in Canada. White Bear sailors were going up to Canada in 1921, 22, 24, 1927. And of course, liquor was available in Canada. And the boats would get shipped back in a freight car. And so my grandfather would take his 2 young sons, Ivor and Buster, to the railroad yard and download the boat out of the boxcar onto a trailer. And this one time, the owner of the boat said, don't put it in the water, bring the boat right to my house. And so Ivor and Buster were riding in the boat. My grandfather was towing it in his car. And they were looking around, and underneath the deck, they find these packages wrapped with straw. And Ivor picks up one and shakes it, and he says, you know, there's liquid in here. And so they went, coming into Delwood, they went around a corner and threw a couple of these packages in the weeds. And so they left the boat, and on the way back, they're riding in the car with my dad, with John. And Ivor says, Dad, stop here. And Buster jumped out and brought back a couple packages from the side of the road. And he says, you know what, Dad, this is whiskey. And I think we should go home and celebrate how well these sailors did in Canada. So in 1940, John O. Johnson was made an honorary member of the White Bear Yacht Club. And here he is sitting on the left next to L.P. Ordway. The Ordways were a great racing family on White Bear. L.P. Lucius Pond Ordway was a winner of many races around 1890. And then he had a son, John G. Ordway, known as Jack Ordway. And in 1906 to 1916, he was winning all the big races. And then his son, John G. Ordway II, I guess, was Smokey Ordway, and he was winning races. And there's another John Ordway, the son of Smokey, in the White Bear area. So here's Walter and Ivor in the so-called front office of the boatworks. And my grandfather in the back room. A lot of wire cables for masts. And 50th wedding anniversary in 1955 for my grandfather and grandmother. With, from the left, Walter, Ivor, and Milton. And here's a picture about 1950 of boats being launched for a regatta on White Bear. This is the dock in front of the boatworks. And this is a more modern, 1980, and you can still see there a lot of the boats are anchored out in the water at that time. And the building on the right, the smaller building on the right, is the fiberglass shop. In about after 1975, the boatworks was making fiberglass boats. And I might have mentioned that back in the 60s, they had 12 to 14 workers, and they might make 100 boats a year. After the late 1970s, they were making fiberglass boats. Well, for wooden boats, it took 3 weeks to make a boat. Fiberglass boats, you can make a boat in 1 week. So it was a lot more efficient and more profitable. So, going back to 1940, my grandfather decides he'd like to have a big cruiser for the river. So he built this boat, this cruiser, in the boatworks, and he made it as big as he possibly could, but still get out the front door. They actually had to take the rub rails off of the side of the boat so they could get it out. Here's a picture of it actually coming out of the lake. So he took the boat that same year at October of 1940. They went down the river with another couple, my grandfather, my grandmother, and Ed and Eva Burnish. Went down the Mississippi, down through New Orleans, across the Gulf to St. Petersburg. And here they are down in St. Petersburg. Spent the winter there. They decided not to try to drive the boat back upstream. They had it loaded on a barge and returned to St. Paul. So he put the boat on the St. Croix River, where my brother David and I spent a lot of happy hours with my grandfather on the cruiser. And one thing they would do when they had an outing, they would go across the river to Wisconsin, where there was a nice sandy beach, and they would just run the front end of the cruiser up gently onto the sand to get it permanently stopped. And then we would play in the sand and go swimming in the river. So, another thing, Ivor and my dad liked to go skiing. And I don't know if you're familiar with North Oaks. Jenny Goodwin is. And we had a ski hill out there. And for a while, before this, before World War II, they had a ski hill out at New Brighton, where the arms plant was later built. And when the Army took over that to build the arms plant, then they had to go somewhere else. So they'd have this portable ski tow on a toboggan. They'd tie it up to a tree at the top of the hill, string out the tow rope, and later on they had a permanent ski tow at North Oaks. So they did a lot of skiing there. That's where I learned how to ski. My grandfather enjoyed building model sailboats. And quite often he'd be in the so-called front office of the boatworks building little model sailboats of the various, they were models of the sailboats that the boatworks built. So here is a model of a Class D, which is, the real boat is 20 feet long. This model that I have is 20 inches long, and the detail is tremendous. Here's a close-up. It looks like a real boat. You know, the sideboards go up and down. It looks like they have ropes and pulleys and everything. He built a model of the Mitazitka. That was the boat that he built in 1900. And that model with another model that he built were featured in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. So he died at age 88 in 1963. And eventually, my cousin Skip was running the boatworks when it was sold. The boatworks business was sold to Melgis, another boat building company, in 1998, which means that the boatworks had been in existence for 102 years. And then the following year, the buildings and land was sold to the city of White Bear Lake. So, A-boats. A-boats sailed on White Bear off and on from 1900 to 1932. Well, in 1932, Labor Day, they had had 4 A-boats racing, a big storm, all 4 boats tipped over, 3 of them broke their masts, and a lot of damage. And that was the end of A-boat racing for, I don't know, 72 years. 2004, Fletcher Driscoll had put together a fleet of 3 A-boats, and now one of them in the foreground there is a wooden A-boat built in 1963 at the Johnson Boat Works. There are now, I believe, 11 A-boats racing on White Bear Lake, which is the largest A-boat fleet in the Midwest. So here's my brother Steve, John's grandson, sailing on the A-boat. And that's the end.